Hey everybody, thank you for coming. My name is Daniel Tancredi and I'm the president and editor-in-chief of The Statesman. First I wanted to briefly introduce the paper. We are the truly independent student newspaper at the University of Pennsylvania. We mostly consist of undergraduates, but we are open to graduate students from all different schools at Penn. We stand for freedom of speech on campus and elsewhere, valuing arguments not for their popularity but for their merit. We espouse objectivity in reporting and passion in discourse on our quest to bring true diversity of thought to the university. So next I want to introduce Chris Tremoglie, who is going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. Hi, I am Chris Tremoglie. I am senior editor of the UPenn Statesman. Pretty much I will be the moderator of the debate tonight. We're going to do a Lincoln Douglas style debate. It's going to start off with Professor Radofsky having 15 minutes, then Michael Tremoglie having 20 minutes, and then Professor Radofsky will have a rebuttal of 5 minutes, and then we will do a Q&A session afterwards. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the speakers. I'm going to be reading directly from here. Professor Radofsky is a founding partner of Karras, Radofsky, Messing, Feinberg, and Lynn LLP, as well as a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where he teaches courses in constitutional criminal procedure, criminal law, and evidence. He has practiced in the civil rights and criminal defense fields for 50 years, with a primary focus on cases involving police and governmental misconduct, prisoners' rights, First Amendment freedoms, due process issues, and racial discrimination. Mr. Radofsky has argued 2 civil rights cases in the United States Supreme Court, Mitchell versus Forsyth in 1985, immunity of the Attorney General for illegal electronic surveillance, and the City of Canton versus Harris in 1989, liability of municipalities for civil rights violations by police. He has also prepared numerous amicus briefs in civil rights cases in the Supreme Court and has argued scores of civil rights and criminal law cases in the federal and state courts. Mr. Radofsky is the author of a number of books and law review articles on civil rights and criminal justice issues. These include police misconduct, law and litigation, and the law of arrest, search, and seizure in Pennsylvania. Mr. Radofsky is past president of the board of directors of the Defender Association of Philadelphia and past vice president of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. In 1986, Mr. Radofsky was a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship Genius Award for his work in criminal justice. He has also been awarded the Judge Gerald F. Flood Award for Public Interest Accomplishments by the Philadelphia Bar Foundation, the ACLU Civil Liberties Lifetime Achievements Award, and the Cesar Beccaria Award, did I pronounce that correctly? For contributions to criminal justice.
It is an Italian name.
Yeah, I botched it. Michael Tremoglie is a former Philadelphia police officer, journalist, writer, and author. He has written for newspapers in the United States and Italy, contributing articles to the Philadelphia Daily News, Philadelphia Inquirer, Pittsburgh Tribune Review, Insight Magazine, another Italian name, Giornale de Sicilia, and the Washington Times. He was an investigative journalist for the Philadelphia Bulletin, whose pieces gained national and international recognition. He has been invited to appear on Fox News Channel's Special Report and MSNBC's Donahue. He has appeared on nationally syndicated radio shows such as Bill Bennett's Morning in America and The Larry Elder Show, as well as local radio programs in New York, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Philadelphia. His work has been featured on the Rush Limbaugh program and other radio talk programs. Some of his articles are referenced in academic journals and included in the record during congressional hearings. Some were reprinted in law reviews. He's the author of a critically acclaimed novel, A Sense of Duty, derived from his experiences on the police force. Active in the community, he started in 2008 a wrestling club to help Philadelphia's minority and inner city youths be competitive with suburban athletes. He also helped coach an inner city high school wrestling team. He, along with his cousin, who is a judge in Sicily, formed Academia Republica, a law and public policy organization in Italy. He is also a member of the steering committee for the Philadelphia chapter of the Federalist Society. Mr. Tremoglie holds a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting and a Master of Science degree in criminal justice, both from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. With that, we will begin what everyone is here for, the debate. We'll start off with Professor Radofsky, who will speak for 15 minutes.
if I can. Yeah, forget about the stand. All right, so welcome. Thanks for the invitation, Mike. I look forward to the debate. An important issue, this question of whether or not police officials, and it's beyond police officials, it's judges, it's prosecutors, it's government officials. The question is, should they be entitled to some kind of immunity? That is, they can't be sued, right? Where other people can be, right? That's the issue. And in context, why it's important is we only get to the question of whether somebody should have some kind of immunity from suit is they've done something wrong. You don't get to immunity unless you can prove that somebody did something wrong, right? So that the question is, assuming somebody does something wrong, they violate the Constitution, whether it's the President of the United States, whether it's a judge, whether it's a prosecutor, whether it's a police official. If they violate the Constitution, is there some reason they shouldn't be liable in court to pay for the injuries that they caused? And so when you think about the immunity doctrine, it's kind of democratic, right? I mean, what is there about immunity? Why should some people have immunity from suit? And it's interesting when we think about our history as a country, the doctrine springs from the English common law that the king can do no wrong. You can't sue the king because the king or queen, by definition, can't do any wrong. So they're immune from suit. And in fact, when the Constitution was started, the theory was you can't sue the sovereign. You can't sue the United States as an entity. Why? Because the United States can't do anything wrong. Maybe you can sue some officials. You can't sue the sovereign. So I want to talk about this issue on two levels. The most important is the policy question, right? Is there some good reason why, if a police officer or a judge or a prosecutor, will deal with police officers mainly, violate your rights, they arrest you without probable cause, they use excessive force, they falsify evidence against you in court, they arrest you because of your race or your gender. Let's assume that's what happens. Under what circumstances, if any, should a court say, you can't sue that person? There's some good reason policy-wise why you do it. Nothing evident when you think about it, when you're sitting there thinking, well, why would you do that, right? Everybody else is liable in court. Why should a government official have some special status? That's the policy question. But underlying it, there's also very fundamental question about who makes that decision. Who decides in this kind of situation whether an official should have some kind of immunity? And the easiest part of this debate for me, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, I think, which is completely dispositive, is the statute under which civil rights suits are brought in the United States. It's a statute that was passed post-Civil War. It was intended, very simple language, basically says, if any governmental actor, including obviously police officers, anybody, any state governmental actor, violates an individual's constitutional rights, which again would require proof that they intentionally violated somebody's rights, then they are liable to that person in damages or possibly for an injunction. The statute says nothing about immunities. In fact, it was amended once only to give judges immunity from suit. So if the judge violates your rights, you can't sue the judge. There is nothing in the statute, and nothing I can say at common law when the statute was passed, where officials had any immunity. In fact, the tradition in this country has been, in reaction to the king can do no wrong, is not to give government officials immunity. It's a famous case right after the signing of the Constitution, where the president ordered a naval captain to stop a ship. We were fighting with France. He told him this, and there was a statute that allowed him to intercept French ships. They intercepted a Dutch ship. The naval captain was held liable in damages, even though the president told him to do it. He wasn't immune. So at the time the statute was passed in 1866, there was no immunity. Congress could have said there's an immunity. They could say, well, police officers are special, judges are special, prosecutors are special. We don't want them sued. It'll deter them from acting forcefully. You can make all kinds of policy arguments. The fact is, qualified immunity is a product of judicial activism. It wasn't Congress that gave immunity. It was the Supreme Court. Starting, and I'll talk a little bit about this, starting in the 1960s, the court said, well, we think maybe police officers are too exposed. We want to give them room to move. We don't want them from withholding action because they think they're going to be sued. All the policy arguments. And the Supreme Court made up this doctrine, qualified immunity. we're going to give them immunity, starting in a very limited way, in a way which I don't disagree. The first case that came up was a case in the 1960s where a black protester during the Civil Rights Movement in Alabama sued a police officer who arrested him for trespass for sitting in at a segregated restaurant, right? They were sitting in. At that time, the Supreme Court had not struck down segregation in restaurants, right? So what the officer did was, at least theoretically, right, in compliance with state law, that was illegal for blacks to sit with whites at the counter. They arrested him for trespass. A couple years later, the Supreme Court said, that's unconstitutional. You can't arrest somebody for that. You can't criminalize that. But when that officer was sued by the protester, the Supreme Court, I think rightfully said actually, wait a minute, at the time he did it, it was, he was acting in accordance with law. He didn't do anything wrong, right? And so we're going to give him this kind of immunity. So on that level, pretty hard to argue with that, right? If the law changes, if the officer acts properly and a year later the Supreme Court changes its mind or Congress changes its mind, that's fine. But the doctrine has morphed into something much greater and much more dangerous than that kind of situation. There have been about 40 decisions in the Supreme Court from that time until the current, and with each decision, the immunity becomes broader and broader. And that's really what I want to talk about. I think on the question of whether this statute gives anybody an immunity, the answer is absolutely clearly no, it doesn't. Historically, the court got it wrong. And I know there are people in this room that think judicial activism is the worst thing in the world, right? Supreme Court makes up the law. You yell about Miranda, you don't like Roe versus Wade, right? I don't like Citizens United, right? So we all argue about when the Supreme Court is activist. This is a classic case of the Supreme Court ignoring what Congress said and saying, we'll read the law, we'll amend the law. Well, that's not what the Supreme Court's supposed to do. They're supposed to interpret it, right? So on that level, if we talk about this civil rights statute, there's almost no argument. I can say there's almost no argument on the other side that historically they got it wrong. Congress could always amend it. Congress can create a remedy. They can limit the remedy. That's perfectly appropriate. It's not for the courts, right, to dive into that debate. But let me talk really more about the policy. So if I was a congressperson or this was an open question, what should we be thinking about in terms of this immunity? And as I say, it's one thing to say if the law changes, we shouldn't punish the officer for doing something that was proper at the time, but that's not the standard anymore. The current standard for qualified immunity, and let me just kind of put it in a factual setting. Officer makes an arrest, and we all know, I'm not going to go too deep into the Fourth Amendment, to make an arrest to be probable cause. You have to have some good reason to think the person committed the crime. To search them, you have to have some good reason to think that they may have evidence on them. You just can't willy-nilly stop people and search them and arrest them. We all agree on that. That's the Fourth Amendment. Assume what the officer did was illegal. And when I say that, the officer has got a lot of latitude for mistake here. This is not a strict liability. So, for example, if I walk out of this building after this debate, and somebody walks up to a police officer and says, I just robbed him, right? The police officer didn't see it. Citizen comes up and says, that guy just robbed me. He can arrest me. I could be completely innocent. The officer could be wrong. The complaint could be wrong. The officer has probable cause. The officer sees something that he thinks is illegal. He's got a lot of room for error within the Fourth Amendment, that he's not strictly liable just because the person turns out to be innocent, just because I don't have any evidence on me, right? A lot of room under the Fourth Amendment. Same with use of force. An officer gets into a fight with a suspect. They're struggling. He thinks the suspect has a gun. He sees something metallic. Preemptively shoots because he thinks the suspect's about to shoot him. It turns out it wasn't a gun. It was a cell phone. Right? He's not liable. Forget about immunity. He's not liable in that situation. He reasonably thought the force was permissible, right? So the test under the Constitution is often reasonableness. We don't hold officers to this very high, perfect standard. They can make mistakes as long as the mistake is reasonable. If the mistake was unreasonable, how can you say they acted in good faith and are entitled to immunity? The immunity is often called a good faith defense, right? So it's really double counting here. And so what's happened in many of these cases, and I'll give you a couple of examples, is that the court determines that there was a constitutional violation. You didn't have probable cause. You used excessive force. You didn't turn over exculpatory evidence when you should have. You should have known that should have been turned over because it could have been used by the defense. Assume the officer has violated the Constitution. Negligence is not enough. From the plaintiff's side, if we're suing an officer, we have to show they acted maliciously, intentionally, or recklessly. Simply negligence is not enough for us to prove, right, the underlying constitutional tort. Once we do that, the question becomes, why should there be an added defense? Where the officer can say, which is now the law, unless no reasonable officer could have thought that was legal, it can't be sued. So the test today, believe it or not, in the Supreme Court, is in that kind of situation, even if I prove the officer violated the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, whatever it might be, there is a full defense to suit. The case gets thrown out, unless almost the same exact case had been decided previously, right? So some court said that use of force was impermissible, that kind of arrest was illegal, unless you're on specific notice that this exact set of facts was addressed before, I can't sue the officer, right? And so what does that mean? It means there are rights and no remedies, right? John Marshall, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said, without remedies, there are no rights. Look around the world, right? Look at constitutions around the world. The worst offenders of human rights in this world have the best constitutions. Read the Constitution of North Korea, read the Constitution of Russia, read the Constitution of Iran. Gives you full panoply of rights, right? The broadest rights you can imagine. Religious rights, First Amendment rights. What do we know about those countries? They're not enforced. And so this is a question of access to the courts and enforcement of rights. Now I understand there can be close cases, right? Where an officer has to make a quick judgment. Use of force, do I arrest, do I not? They're called on to make these judgments all the time, their lives at stake. I understand that completely. But the constitutional standard itself gives them a lot of protection. And once you reach the point, which by definition you do, where the officer has acted intentionally in violating somebody's rights, you make that determination, the question is, why do they get the special benefit? The special benefit of this full immunity. No other citizen gets that. You get sued, you don't say, well, yeah, I did something wrong, but it was a close call, right? Therefore you can't sue me. If you're a criminal defendant, and there's some question about the vagueness of a statute, and you make the wrong decision about what you do under that statute, you can't say, I misread the statute, you can't punish me. You'll be punished. Court says what you did was wrong, you have no immunity, you have no protection there. And so what you've got here, and the question is accountability and remedies. If you don't have a civil suit, and the irony here is, qualified immunity applies in civil cases. Criminal defendants who are charged, as we know, we have a whole debate about the exclusionary rule. What if the officer violates your rights, seizes evidence, right, and the court says, no, you didn't have a warrant, didn't have probable cause. Courts can suppress that evidence, right? The defendant in that case has a remedy, right? By definition, you're dealing in civil rights cases with innocent people. These are people who aren't charged with a crime. They have no remedy in criminal court. Their only remedy in our judicial system, if they've suffered injuries and damages, then it might be physical injuries, it might be 8 years in jail because the officer created false evidence, whatever it might be. There's some serious cases out there. Look at some of the innocence cases where people spent 30 years in jail because of misconduct. And now the argument is, you can't sue me because no court had ever addressed these exact facts before. Therefore, I wasn't on notice that my conduct may have violated the Constitution. I mean, that's what qualified immunity is. And as I say, on a policy level, at some level it's defensible. But now the Supreme Court says whether you act in good faith or bad faith doesn't matter. The officer can act in bad faith, still has qualified immunity. The only question is, when we look at his conduct, was it, and this is the way they frame it, no reasonable officer could have thought that that was legal. I mean, when you think about that as a standard to overcome from the plaintiff's side, it means that in a lot of cases, you simply don't have relief. And here's the final point. The rationale for the rule, as the Supreme Court has expressed it for many years, again, in a statute that doesn't give any immunity, they've created this immunity by their own judicial reasoning, is it will deter officers, right, from acting in an aggressive fashion, in a fashion we want them to act, right? They're going to think, wait a minute, why should I should take a chance, right? If I arrest this guy, I can get sued, right? I don't make a whole lot of money. I lose my house. I lose my my bank account, right? So I'm going to hesitate, and we get less protection from officers. And I understand that argument, right? There's always that balance. Of course, that's the balance the Fourth Amendment draws. That's the balance the First Amendment draws. And for those of you with conservative leanings, this statute, 1983, isn't only used by people suing the police or the government. They're used by Second Amendment advocates, right? It's used by property rights advocates. It is the main statute for enforcing civil rights of everybody in this country, right, left, and the middle. And the fact is, officers never pay. In 99, I can tell you, there's been recent studies done, in 99% of lawsuits against police officers, close to 99% of lawsuits, either there's insurance that's been paid by the city, so the officers are covered by insurance, the city's covered by insurance, or in a city like Philadelphia, they're self-insured, and there's something called indemnification. So if an officer gets sued in Philadelphia, and he's provided with a lawyer from the law department, if there's a settlement or a judgment by a jury, the officer never pays. The city pays. So this argument that we need this immunity, right, to protect the officer from financial harm, I understand that argument. If I thought I'm going to lose everything I have because I make some mistake, I might hesitate. That's not the real world. The real world in our system is what we call indemnification. The city pays, right? And so even the rationale that the court has used, we don't want to deter, we don't want to chill the officer in the exercise of his enforcement duties, simply doesn't work in the real world. Final point. I'll come back to this in the 5 minutes, give me 30 seconds. I talked before about this notion of accountability, and what remedies there are. For the innocent person in this situation, whose rights may have been violated, its damages are nothing. There's no other remedy. There's no suppression. You can't get an injunction against the officer for doing it in the future. The Supreme Court's closed that door. Could the officer be subject to criminal charges if they really were outside the fold? That's possible. There's internal discipline that's possible also. But the only judicial relief that an innocent person has whose rights have been violated, and again, this whole debate is premised on the notion that what the officer did was a violation of the rights. If it's not, we never get to immunity. He's simply not liable. He didn't do anything wrong. So in that situation, given our system, where the courts have kind of closed the doors to civil rights actions by saying you can't get an injunction, you can't get damaged in this kind of situation, they've limited the exclusionary rule, we are creating this facade of rights, right? We have all these great rights, we love to preach to the world, right? We've got the best constitution in the world, we have the best court system in the world, right? We enforce rights. When you peek behind the curtain, right, and you start looking at some of these cases, and I'll give you some examples when I come back of how courts have used qualified immunity to defeat legitimate claims, I hope you think twice about that doctrine.
All right, off the back. Okay.
Here it is.
You get a police officer wear a wire, that's like a whole different thing here.
You get a warrant?
Yeah, I know. By the way, I only accept money in white envelopes too, so. All right, let's see if I do this correctly. Okay, try to put this on my palette. Oh, over here. Thanks, man, appreciate that.
A little bit higher.
A little higher, yeah.
A little higher. Right about there. Is that all right?
Yeah.
You hear? Is that okay?
Put it on.
All right. Helps if it's on.
Good.
Is that better now? You hear?
Yeah.
All right, well, after hearing Professor Radowski's bio, you're starting to wonder if this is my Spartacus moment. It's a little bit like I'm playing Rocky Balboa to his Apollo Creed. We'll see. I'd like you to pretend for a moment that you are a white police officer in Southwest Philadelphia. And it's the Philadelphia Police Department's 12th District, which earned the nickname the Fighting 12th because of the proclivity of the residents to assault police officers. It's poor it's black, it's crime-ridden. You're working in van, which means you're working with a partner. Ordinarily, as a police officer, you work by yourself in Philadelphia, but when you're working in van, you're working with a partner. Your partner is a African-American. He's a 10-year veteran. He's taciturn. He knows the job, and he knows how to teach a rookie, which is what you are at this point. It's a cool October night, about 9 p.m. You get a call for a report of a burglary. And you drive to the location. You don't put lights and sirens on. That's you see in the movies. You just drive there quickly, safely, but you get there. You pull up on location. There's a house. You see a light on in the window. You walk up. Your partner tells you, since he's a veteran, he wants to see how I handle it, how you handle this. So he says, "You go ahead. You take this one." You see through an open window. You see two men in there, watching TV, drinking beer. Perhaps Monday Night Football. At those days it was on. Your partner, you knock on the door. Now you don't, knock, please, knock. Now you don't do that. That's what you do when you're serving a warrant, or if there's a loud party or something like that. You just knock on the door, ring a doorbell, wait to see if somebody answers. In this case, the gentleman answers, says, "Well, what are you doing here?" You tell him you got a report of a burglary. He smiles and he tells you that, well, he had trouble opening his door, and maybe that's why some of the neighbors thought somebody was breaking in his house. What do you do at that point? Don't tell me anything. I just want to hold that thought. We'll get back to it at the end. But think about that. What are you going to do? You got a report of a burglary. You pull up. You have two guys sitting there drinking beer, watching TV. They tell you had trouble opening the door. This is ironically very much like a case out in Boston some years back where I think it was Professor Henry Gates, Lewis Henry Gates, I think it was, had been arrested by a police officer for trying to get into his own house, who thought that, somebody thought he was breaking in. So again, what do? Do you call police radio and ask for a complainant? Do you look for evidence of a break-in? What do you do? Like I said, we'll get back to it towards the end. What I want to do right now, though, is I want to tell you about who I am, what I do, and what I think I can bring to this conversation. First is where I come from, South Philadelphia. Specifically, I was born in what is now the gentrified area of Point Breeze. But back then, it was an ethnically, racially, religiously diverse neighborhood. It was on the low end of the economic scale. The school district I went to was predominantly black. By the time I got into high school, which was predominantly Jewish, I was always in a minority. And so I've lived the diversity that others can only speak about. The second thing is, not only do I have a graduate degree in criminal justice, but I also was a white police officer in a crime-ridden black neighborhood. You see, unlike most people who talk about these things, I know what it's like to have a 12-gauge Remington shotgun pointed at you. Okay, and it looks about that big, by the way, when it's pointed at you. I know what it's like to get a call for a rape in progress, and you put lights and sirens on, and you're driving very quickly. That's when you put your lights and sirens on, by the way, when you get that. And you pull up on location, and you see a guy on top of a woman pounding her head into the sidewalk, and you know it's a domestic dispute. This isn't a rape. And then when you try to arrest a guy who is twice your size, his wife starts hanging all over you because she doesn't want you to arrest him. And he's coming at you about 90 miles an hour now. Okay. I also know what it's like to respond to a call of a man with a gun inside the house and nearly shoot a little kid. And that's I think is the issue before us tonight. The third thing I can bring are the facts. And as John Adams once said, facts are stubborn things. Ironically, he said this while he was defending some British soldiers against the use of deadly force. Okay, they were accused of deadly force, excessive force, and he was defending them. It's been said that the first casualty in war is the truth, and this is no less valid when it comes to the propaganda war being waged against the police. The media is the vanguard of this effort, but it's not alone. There's academicians involved with it, there's journalists involved with it, lawyers involved with it, and they enthusiastically make moral judgments days, weeks, months, and years later that a police officer has to make in a nanosecond. All too often, these judgments are made among a miasma of hate and fear-mongering designed to prejudice those judgments. You'll see later on what I mean by this. But right now I'm going to need 7 names. I'm going to read 7 names. I want you to raise your hands if you recognize the name. Walter Scott. Does anybody name? No.
Sir.
Walter Scott.
Not Sir Walter.
No, not Sir Walter. Walter Scott. A couple of people recognize the name? Okay. Michael Brown. Nearly everybody recognizes that name. Eric Garner. Nearly everybody recognizes that name. Tanya Haggerty. Nobody's ever heard of her. Dylan Taylor. Gilbert Collar. Bobby Dean Knight. Okay. So the first 3, well, except for Walter Scott, they're all well known. They were unarmed black suspects killed by white police officers. They all made national and indeed even international news. And in some cases, they caused riots. The next 4, though, were all unarmed suspects shot and killed by black or Hispanic police officers. But you never heard about these shootings in the national news. Let me describe them. Tanya Haggerty was an unarmed black female shot and killed by a black female Chicago police officer. The officer testified she saw a shiny object in her hand that was a gun. And you heard David allude to that earlier. The family disputes this. The incident didn't make national news or set off rioting. Now, tell me, what is more newsworthy than a black female Chicago police officer shooting and killing a black female in a car stop who was unarmed? Okay. But yet somehow that didn't seem to be newsworthy on the national news. Dylan Taylor was a white 20-year-old Salt Lake City unarmed man who was shot and killed about the same time as Michael Brown was in Ferguson, Missouri. He was killed by an Hispanic police officer. There was a video, but it certainly didn't make national news. Gilbert Collar was a white 18-year-old University of South Alabama student. He was shot and killed by a black University of South Alabama police officer. He was unarmed. Indeed, he was naked, which even precludes the possibility of somebody saying he was reaching for something. Okay? But the national media didn't report it. What do you think would have been the reaction if he were a black Alabama student and the officer were white? Do you think it would have made national news? I'm pretty sure it would have. Bobby Dean Knight was a 70-year-old white man shot and killed during a traffic stop by a black deputy South Carolina sheriff. Excuse me, by a black South Carolina deputy sheriff. There was a video of this. It didn't make national news like the Walter Scott shooting. Now, for those of you who don't know Walter Scott, he was the guy that was running away from a police officer in South Carolina, and a police officer shot him in the back and then put a taser down next to him. Why is this? Because the reporting of these shootings is racially skewed. It's designed intentionally or not, I don't know, to inflame people's feelings. Worse than that, though, are the fake news. Here are some examples of outrageous and erroneous allegations about law enforcement made in the media. And it's across the ideological continuum, by the way. Police are bashed from all sides. It's conservatives, it's libertarians, it's liberals. No matter what the newspaper is or the publication, they're bashing cops. An article in the St. Louis newspaper said unarmed blacks are shot every 28 hours. This was repeated by a CNN pundit and elsewhere. It wasn't true. Articles in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, National Review, all conservative publications, and the Weekly Standard, all contain the allegation, and you can't make this stuff up, all contain the allegation that the Consumer Product Safety Commission and the Fish and Wildlife Service had SWAT teams. And can you imagine the Fish and Wildlife Service having a SWAT team? It didn't. And it wasn't true, and as far as I know, only the Wall Street Journal issued a retraction. Amnesty International, one of the premier civil rights organizations, and the ACLU, both claimed in a 2004 report that Timothy McVeigh was able to flee after the Oklahoma City bombing because law enforcement was looking for an Arab terrorist. Okay? This same claim, as I said, was repeated by the ACLU. Well, what they did, ACLU and Amnesty International, was basically repeat a false news story that was printed in a Chicago newspaper in when the bombing occurred in 1995. Okay? The truth was McVeigh was correctly profiled by Cliff Van Sant, who was the FBI profiler, within 24 hours of the bombing. He had been stopped for, I think, a bad license plate, expired license plate, by an Oklahoma Highway Patrol officer. And car stops are something civil libertarians are always talking about as being too pretextual. He was stopped, he was taken into custody, and he was arraigned within 48 hours. That was the truth, but that's not what you heard in the news. This disinformation campaign against police officers leads to changes in legal and public policy. Ultimately, this disinformation has a deleterious effect not only on police, but also on the public that they serve. Walter Williams, a well-known African-American intellectual who was from Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, said to me once, "Most Americans don't live under the conditions that many low-income minorities confront. They would have an entirely different view of policing if they had to have bars at their windows, worry about stray shots, and have to walk past thugs standing on corners preying on their families. They wouldn't begin to have their kids attend schools in Philadelphia such as Simon Gratz, Benjamin Franklin, or Martin Luther King." And here's some more facts you're not going to hear in the news: Fox, MSNBC, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Numerous studies dating back 40 years indicate that the best predictor of police use of force is the attitude of the suspect. As one professor told me, in general, if a suspect is nasty, then he will be treated nastily. One study even found, in general, white officers were more likely to arrest suspects than black officers, but black suspects were more likely to be arrested when the decision maker was a black officer. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, this is the federal government now, nearly 2/3 of police shootings from 1980 to 2008 were intraracial. It's also worth noting that 3/4 of civilian justifiable homicides were also intraracial. So that's a black officer shooting a black suspect, a white officer shooting a white suspect, and on the civilian side, it's a white civilian shooting a white person and a black civilian shooting a black person. Most of this is all intraracial, okay? It's a minority when it's interracial. According to the University of Chicago's prestigious National Opinion Research Center, in 2016, nearly 3 of 10 Americans don't think police officers should defend themselves even when being assaulted. Think about that. 3 out of 10 Americans, according to this, and this is a pretty prestigious survey firm, says a police officer should never hit somebody back. This figure has increased dramatically from 3.1% about 40 years ago. And as one person once told me when they said this, they said that they think about, out of those Americans, about 50% of them are journalists on CNN. I don't know. Often you hear in the media and in universities about racial disparities. I'm certain you'll know the one that states blacks are killed by X times more than whites by police, but here's some racial disparities you don't normally hear. Once again, going back to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, from 1976 to 1998, young black males murdered police officers at a rate almost 6 times higher than that of young white males. According to FBI data, 543 officers were murdered from 2007 to 2016. 206, or 48%, of the known killers of law enforcement officers during this period were African American. From 2004 to 2013, blacks were 43% of the known killers of law enforcement officers. So you have a 40-year period from 76 to 2016 where blacks murdered law enforcement officers at a rate 4 to 6 times higher than white males. But you don't hear this information in the news, and you won't. I would suggest that both the racial disparities of police shooting blacks and blacks shooting police are not the result of racism, but the result of the crime in those neighborhoods. And that's the issue that has to be solved. Why is there such high crime in there? Now you may ask, what does all this have to do with qualified immunity for police? Well, it's quite simple. Public opinion drives policy. If Americans can be persuaded that police are brutal racist killers, then it'll be easy to have legislators and courts roll back the qualified immunity or expand the remedies for lawsuits against police. Right now, a police officer is only subject to this under certain circumstances, as David mentioned. If that happens, if these immunities, this qualified immunity, this limited immunity is rolled back, this would be a boon to tort lawyers because, among other things, suing police is a gold mine for tort lawyers. Now, let me furnish an example of what I mean. And this comes from no less a bashing of left-wing thought than the New York Times. Okay. It's published an article titled, "How to Sue the Police and Win. Lawyers Share Trade Secrets of the Growth Industry." Some of the key points. Suing police is a growth industry. One lawyer quoted in the piece was a former medical malpractice lawyer. She said suing police is much more difficult than suing doctors. A week before this article was published, a jury awarded $41 million, which is $60 million in 2018, to a man shot by police who shot at 3 people. It's what they call the Bronx jury effect, or here in Philadelphia, they call it the South Philadelphia jury effect. Adjusted for inflation, lawyers earning, now these aren't the awards, these are just the earnings, approximately $30 million in 2018 dollars just in one city in 1 year in New York. The article said, indeed, as a cultural marker, and this was a conference that this was being done, the conference seemed to define how views of the police have darkened since the days when officers were uniformly portrayed as either heroic, like Joe Friday, or lovable, like Officer Joe Bolton. As I mentioned, because of the media's biased reporting, the demonization of police by lawyers have succeeded. Now, when do you think this article was written? Recently? October 2nd, 1999. It's almost 20 years ago. It's quite natural for people to want to blame someone or something after a tragedy. Doctors are often sued not because they did something wrong, but because someone wants an explanation for a tragic event. That's obvious, it's just human nature. I mean, doctors also sued out of pure greed, but that's another issue for another time. So it's the case with police. A police officer injured or killed someone while in the legitimate necessary performance of his or her duties. It was an understandable mistake, but nonetheless a mistake. So the courts, the way they're operating right now, will not permit the police to be sued when there's no flagrant violation. The rationale for qualified immunity is to protect all but, quote, the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. It's not to let the police get away with murder. It's to prevent frivolous and baseless lawsuits from proceeding. And this doctrine, by the way, has withstood courtroom challenges for at least 30 years now, so it's almost been a generation. Let me conclude my talk from where I began, the report of a burglary. Okay, I asked you what you would have done in this case. Can somebody have any idea what they would have done? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I would have asked for some type of evidence to support that that was his house. So
Okay. What would you have asked for?
some kind of mail that indicates that he's had.
So somebody's coming to your house, and they're going to ask you to get, you want a utility bill, right?
Yeah.
Do you think you're going to get it? If somebody came to your house and asked you for that, would you give it to them?
I would ask for their ID first.
Okay, that's the police officers in uniform, you come up to your house and said,
I still want the ID from the police officer.
okay, they give you the ID, you know your short sleeve, what would you do? You'd actually say, you'd run in to go through your bills and go get
Say
that.
that I'm following up on the order that I've been sent here for,
Interesting.
and then I would.
Anybody else? You have any ideas? Come on, some of these are going to be lawyers, civil libertarian lawyers one day suing police. You got to have an idea what you would do in this case. Nobody? Yes, sir.
I would use contextual cues to assess whether the situation.
Okay, you're way above my vocabulary. What do you mean by that? What's that mean, contextual cues? Remember, I'm just an ex-cop from South Philly, so you know.
I'm a social worker.
Okay.
So I care about context.
Mm-hmm.
In that situation, I think, as the lady suggested, asking for a piece of identification is sufficient, to assess whether that person is rightfully in their own home or has broken into another's home. I work in crime-ridden black neighborhoods and I don't carry a gun, and I've used alternative problem-solving skills to protect myself and others.
Okay.
I've been
Anybody else?
confronted with weapons.
Yes, sir.
Ask for the house keys.
Ask for the house keys, okay. All right, let me tell you what I did. After he said that to me, which sounded perfectly plausible, now remember, I'm a white cop and I'm in a black neighborhood, okay? I said, okay, fine. I turned around and walked away. He closed the door. Now, Johnny Simon, my partner, and I said the African-American, 10 years my senior, he grabs me by the collar and he pulls me back and he says, did you ask for ID? I said, no. He muttered something about me being stupid or something like that, and he walks to the door, knocks on the door of the house. Same guy answers. He goes, you got any ID? This guy said, what? He goes, do you have any, Simon, do you have any ID? He goes, get out of here. He goes, you're only asking us that because we're black, and if this was a white neighborhood, you'd never do something like that. And then this other guy comes in, and he starts yelling, and next thing you know, everybody's yelling at one another, and this thing's ready to explode. And then down from the steps, from the second floor, come two elderly black women dressed in their night clothes. And they're saying, one woman says, what's going on here? And then the one woman said the words that crystallized everything. She said, officers, who are these people? Okay? They were burglars. They were very clever. When they saw the police come up, They put the TV on, they grab a couple of cans of beer from the refrigerator, and sat down and act like they just lived there. Okay? If God knows what would happen to those two ladies if I was the only one answering that call and I just would have turned around and went away. Who knows what would have happened to them? I mean, at the very least, I'm sure they would have been burglarized. But then, things being the way they are today, who knows? So, what I'm getting at is there are a lot of variables in police work, many uncertainties. Judgments have to be made in seconds. So, to those who want to pontificate and claim that they can judge the difference between right and wrong with the precision of an algebraic equation, I say, heed the words of John Jay, who wrote in Federalist Number 3, among the many objects to which a wise and free people find it necessary to direct their attention, that of providing for their safety seems to be the first. Keep this in mind when people try to convince you that we need more reasons to publish police officers for mistakes made on the job. I look forward to a stimulating discussion. Thanks for your coming tonight, and David, thanks for being here too.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Let me just take a couple minutes to respond to the questions. Yeah.
You gotta get hooked up here.
So, of course, the short answer to the burglary situation is that the officers didn't do anything wrong. They wouldn't be sued. You wouldn't get the qualified immunity. They get a call about a burglary. They're allowed to go to the house. They can ask some questions. You're right. You ask for identification. Right? Something looks amiss. Where's the key? Where's the identification? These guys wouldn't have had it, right? Forget about it. Utility bills. They don't have identification. They don't have a driver's license. They don't have a key to the house. You get some suspicion going. Probably at that point, you can do a little, sweep through the house just to see, who's there. You find the women. If somebody came to me with a lawsuit on that, to sue him, I'd say, you're crazy. You wouldn't get to first base. Forget about qualified immunity. You don't need immunity. They didn't do anything wrong. And that's what I said before about probable cause. There are two possibilities here. Maybe they were completely innocent, right? Maybe it was their ass, right? In either case, the officers can follow up on the lead. It depends on what kind of information they have. I guess some rumor that somebody 3 days ago broke into a house is a little different than get some evidence right up front. But I feel like we're ships passing in the night. This isn't a debate about whether we've got good cops or bad cops. It's not a debate about whether black cops arrest white more often or who shot. And we could always use statistics, right? Look at the statistics for marijuana arrests in Philadelphia, a city that's kind of half white, half minority. By every self-reporting standard, whites probably use marijuana more than blacks. Look at the statistics for arrests in Philadelphia, just simple possession. I've been tracking that for 20 years. 90% of the people arrested for possession of marijuana are black. Now, that's a function not because the police may be kind of individually doing something wrong. I often say this, if we had many cops in the Penn dorms as we did in North Philadelphia, you'd have a little different ratio there, right? Use of marijuana is pervasive. We target certain areas, right? And that's where we get those racial disparities. It doesn't prove one thing or another, right? I mean, that's not the point. We're supposedly debating qualified immunity. If we're at the point where the officer does something deliberately wrong, that's the question, right? Why should they have some added protection? And you can get some pretty egregious cases. Let me just give you a recent opinion from an appellate court, a Fourth Circuit appellate court in the United States on qualified immunity, just to see how this doctrine has been applied in a way which I think you'll say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Pretty simple case. The plaintiffs are, the people who eventually file a lawsuit, they're originally criminal defendants, they're charged with fraud and some transaction with the store. 2 days later, the store owner comes back to the police and says, you know what, we made a mistake. There was no fraud, right? Withdraw the charges. The police detective does not withdraw the charges. The district attorney does not withdraw the charges. So there's still a warrant out for this husband and wife. Even though the complainant has come in and said, we've checked our records again, they paid, the credit card was paid, there was no fraud. 3 months later, the husband gets stopped in a traffic stop, and there's an outstanding warrant. He gets arrested. He's brought into court. He spends overnight in jail. The owner of the store comes in the next day and says, he's innocent. I told them 3 months ago that they should withdraw the charges. At that point, he's released. He doesn't do anything even in a lawsuit. He's held for 12 hours. He doesn't sue. The wife is also named in the warrant, right? And the owner says, again, you know, we also charge the wife, make sure you pull that warrant on her, right? 3 weeks later, she's arrested, driving. She has just given birth to a child. She's breastfeeding. She's arrested on a Friday night. She's held for 3 days in custody on this warrant. She's brought in, and of course, at the end of the day, right, on Monday, they say, oh, sorry, and they release her. So she sues the police officer, right, the detective who didn't withdraw the warrant, and the prosecutor who didn't withdraw the warrant. And what does the court say? Which is exactly what my point in this case is, yes, there was a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, right? when a complainant comes to you and says, you know what, I made false charges, you got to withdraw the charges, right? Pretty basic principle in our society. And then the court says, on the other hand, you can't sue these officers. Why not? We've never had a case before where we have said explicitly that an officer, upon a detective or a prosecutor, upon being informed that the charges are false, should withdraw the charges. Now, common sense would kind of tell you that's what you do. And so she was out of court, right? She was breastfeeding. She couldn't breastfeed a baby for 3 days. She's in jail for 3 days. She couldn't make bail because there's no judge on over the weekend. And the courts of the United States block her lawsuit. Now listen, we can all get egregious cases. You can always kind of, you know, find some abuse of a doctrine. But I can tell you, I've been following these cases for years. There are hundreds of cases like this. The last example I'll give is one that's pending in the U.S. Supreme Court. Border shooting at the border of Mexico. A border officer shoots across the border, kills a young Mexican kid in the back. On all the facts, it's just an outright manslaughter or murder. Nothing went on. The officer is sued by the family of the young Mexican. And the defense is not, I fired permissibly because they thought he had a gun or not. The defense is, even if I did something intentionally wrong, because a Mexican family can't sue in the U.S. courts, which is true, it's this jurisdictional question, I get qualified immunity, even though I acted deliberately in killing this person, assume that's what happened, because I didn't know that that person might be able to sue me in the U.S. courts. No court had ever said that was permissible, and if you say it now for the first time, it's not fair to me. Well, think about that for a moment, right? If qualified immunity is supposed to protect the officer who acts in good faith, right? He's going to be protected acting completely in bad faith, right? Completely fortuitous. He doesn't even know if he's a Mexican citizen or a U.S. citizen. If he turned out to be a U.S. citizen, he could be sued, right? He doesn't know who this person is. And now he's got a viable claim of immunity. There's something wrong with the doctrine that permits people to avoid liability when they've done something deliberately wrong, they've acted recklessly, they get all kinds of protection, all these cases you talked about, the officer may have acted permissibly, but then to say, we won't allow the courts to function because they need some special protection, that's the only argument.
All right. We're at time. I guess we now open it up for Q&A.
You want to stand up here and Chris, we're calling people, or Dan or somebody? Sure.
I think in terms of the consequences of police officers not having immunity, and I guess two of the things that occur to me, one of them is, given the difficulty, the dangerousness, the negatives of that particular occupation, I would wonder what the consequence would be of not having immunity on the number and the quality of people that would choose to go into that profession if they knew that if I did make a wrong move, I could lose my house, my pension, everything. I mean,
It's certainly a fair point, which is exactly what the point I made before. Governments take that into consideration, right? The FOP in Philadelphia has a contract with the city. Under that contract, they're indemnified. Every police officer in Philadelphia, if they are found responsible, by settlement or not, the city of Philadelphia pays them money.
Is that a guarantee?
They're provided with a lawyer, that's right. The only cases, this is interesting, the only cases where they don't is where, it's extremely rare, is where the officer has been charged criminally, right? So they charge with murder, and and then the city kind of walks away from them, and of course you're not going to collect against that person anyway, right? If they want him in jail. And that's not just true in Philadelphia. Studies around the country, 99% of every one of these cases, the officer does not pay. They don't pay for the lawyer, and they don't pay any judge. You're right. I mean, of course, that's true for all professions, right? You could always think, if I'm a lawyer and I want to kind of, I'm getting close to the line, I think if this is what I have to do to represent my client, if I step over the line, I can get sued. Who's my, every profession has to deal with that. And nobody else has this kind of special extra level of protection. If there's proof that you did wrong, that's what we deal with. And again, there's a lot of protection built into the system before we even reach the question of whether you need immunity.
Speaking of lawyers, just to follow up my thought, I also wonder about how this would clog the courts if people could sue police officers, adding another layer to what the courts have to deal with. That's another thought.
They sue them anyway. I mean, the qualified immunity comes up, right? If it's, the courts are not overclogged with these cases. It's the court system functions, and it's like with medical malpractice. Every study you read about medical malpractice, you always hear about the cases, that questionable. Why would you even sue? Every study that's been done by the medical profession is that there are probably 100 cases of a valid malpractice that never brought. These are not easy cases to bring. You got to hire a lawyer. You've got to have significant damages. Litigating a lawsuit can be very expensive for the person who brings the lawsuit. There are experts involved. There are court fees involved. There are depositions involved. In my office, for every complaint we get, right, of possible abuse, we probably file or make a claim in 1 out of 50 cases. Not because I don't think somebody's rights were violated, but it's simply not, even from an economic point of view, something that is worth bringing.
Okay, let me respond to your question there. First of all, police officers don't have absolute immunity. They have limited immunity. Okay, so it's not that they don't have total immunity. No, they're allowed to be sued. The argument that David's bringing is that how much, under what circumstances should that be? And yes, what I'm saying is valid. It gets down to your point, under certain circumstances. Let me give you another anecdote. This comes from my cousin, who was a lieutenant in sex crimes, or now special victims unit. And he had a case where there was a serial rapist in, I think it was Kensington. And they had a composite description of the rapist, and they had a description of the jacket. In those days, it was 8-ball jackets. I don't know if anybody remembers 8-ball jackets, and the big black circle with the number 8, and they were very popular in certain communities back then. He went out. The last rape that he committed, they took the car. The guy took the car, and this guy was a brutal rapist. I mean, he would hit women with brass knuckles that had spikes on it. Okay, in fact, one victim, this poor woman had holes in her neck, and he was wondering how the hell did that happen? That she's got holes in her neck, and that's what he said. He had hit her with this thing. Shot her. Okay, the poor woman was so devastated by what happened to her, she eventually wound up committing suicide. So he gets a call one day that the car that this woman had was found abandoned in a certain neighborhood. So he figures, well, this is probably where the rapist is, because he didn't think the rapist is going to, park the car 10 miles away from his house. He figures he's going to leave it where he lives. He starts riding around that neighborhood on a daily basis, looking for this guy. He finally sees a guy matching the composite with the jacket. He goes up, and he was with a female officer. He goes up, they both go up to the guy, they grab him. They talk to him, they say they want to bring him in, they put handcuffs on him, they throw him in the back of their car. Now their car was unmarked, they're both in plain clothes. While he's in the backseat of the car, he's fidgeting around. He's got handcuffs on and he's fidgeting. Okay? And he said that the handcuffs were too tight. I said, okay, don't worry about it, we'll get off here in a little while. They bring him back to the station. They have to let him go, because they really had, at this point, they really didn't have a warrant. They figured maybe it was reasonable suspicion to bring this guy in, but they can't really hold him. Let him go. About a week or so later, or a couple of days later, I'm sorry, they get a warrant for him. And you'll have to forgive me about the time, I'm not exactly sure of the time. I want to say it was a couple of days later. They get a warrant, they go to his house. They bring an Hispanic-speaking officer with them. This suspect and another person are talking in Spanish to one another. And the suspect says they'll never find the gun because he left it in the back of the cop's car. So it was in his back, and for some reason they missed it when they frisked him, and he took the gun, he stuck it in between the seat, and he stuck it way down there. They arrested the guy was convicted. So I asked Tom, his name's Tom McDowell, I asked Tom, I said, Tom, what would you do if you didn't have qualified immunity? What would you do if you had no immunity at all in these circumstances? He said he would never even bother to ride around. Because if he would have stopped this guy because he looked like the suspect, because he had a jacket on like the suspect, but let's say the suspect started resisting arrest, and he had to hit the guy or shoot him or something, then he's got all sorts of problems. And going back to the anecdote that I gave you about the burglary, what's being admitted here, and what David's admitting, is that, you know, it's very facile to say, yes, they did something wrong, and sure, you ask for identification and so on and so forth, as you were saying, as you said, right? But don't forget, these guys are starting to argue now, okay? And you're only doing this because you're a white cop, and this is a black neighborhood, and next thing you know, now supposing it was their house. Supposing you ask for ID, and you insist on ID, supposing, and they start getting mad, and they start trying to hit you, and you in the back, and or whatever, now you're on the front page of the Inquirer because you're a racist, and you're only doing this because you're a white cop in a black neighborhood. You never reduce the white people. Then you get sued. Okay, now because you have qualified immunity and because you know legally you're okay to do all these things, that was fine. Supposing you don't have qualified immunity. Supposing the lawyer makes the case that you're the biggest racist in the world, and they start looking at every arrest you've made for the past, you know, since you've been on the force. And they look at, you know, whatever you said to somebody when you were in 5th grade or when you got in a fight with a black kid in high school or something like that. Yeah, next thing you know, you're stuck. So these are the types of things that weigh on a police officer's mind. And I understand that, you know, we're not trying to say that the bad officer gets off. Nobody, you know, nobody likes a brutal officer. I mean, I didn't like working with, and I've met guys that were that way, and I didn't like working with them. I said, because if they're going to do something to somebody, they're going to do it to me too. I don't want to be in the car with them. I don't want to be in the squad with them. Okay? And when he ran across them, he tried to get rid of them. Okay? Because they're no good. They're no good for anybody else. They're no good, and especially no good for your partners. Now, you got to be careful, though, between that and an overly aggressive officer. Not somebody that's doing something criminal or just out of mean, or I'm talking about an overly aggressive officer, somebody that will go in and stop somebody and pat him down and, you know, harshly talk to him or something along those lines. That's aggressive police work. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it wasn't. I wasn't an aggressive police officer. I was more reactive. Some of my people I worked with were more proactive. Sometimes their style worked better, sometimes my style worked better. I got more cooperation. Sometimes when people are uncooperative, the aggressive police officer work better. There's no formula to this. And that's why I say, you know, you get people who want to make the judge the difference between right and wrong with a precision and algebraic equation and bring in a court. Now, what you're saying is the truth. You're going to get police officers to back off. It happened in Baltimore after the Freddie Gray incident. And all those officers were either acquitted or charges were dropped. And you saw crime spike up in Baltimore because of it.
Yeah, I have a question. I think part of you guys are talking past each other, and I'm wondering if this is the explanation. Mike, your view is that because of the explanations you gave about the media and whatever, that the whole system is tilted in a direction where unjustifiably cops are going to be harassed, hassled, sued, when they shouldn't be. And you're saying that if you allow that to happen by removing the immunity that they have, it's only going to get worse, because you gave lots of examples where the system isn't fair to police officers. David, I think what you're saying is that the system is pretty fair, and that when the system determines, when there's a ruling that a police officer has violated, let's say, some constitutional requirement, that's fair and valid, and there should be a way of following up. So I think the difference is you have different assumptions about how fair police officers are being treated in this litigious situation. Could you respond to that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. No, what you're saying is and maybe I'm not explaining myself properly. What I would like, what I'm trying to get, the point I'm trying to get here is, yes, right now the system is relatively fair. But as you saw from that article in 1999 by the New York Times, the point is to make it unfair, okay? To make it fertile ground for people to make money, or people who genuinely believe that their civil liberties are violated. And I'm not going to suggest, I will never suggest that people's civil liberties are not violated from time to time. But as you see from the reportage, okay, there's this campaign to demonize police, to vilify them, okay? And that's undeniable. And the gentleman that was supposed to be here, before David graciously took his place, was a guy from the Cato Institute. And the Cato Institute has been on a fierce campaign to really make police out to be the biggest sons of bitches in the world. Okay, they really are. Pardon my French. Like I said, I'm an ex-guy from South Philly. I'm not all that refined. They are really trying their best to do this, and they do it by. They had a police misconduct website, and let me give you an example. They talked about a story in Florida where a guy was shot simply because he opened up a door carrying a gun. Now, he has a Second Amendment right to carry that gun, they said, and it was 12:30 in the morning, and he wasn't expecting the cops, and the cops should have never shot at him and killed him. Okay. Now, my question to you is, if somebody opens the door and has a gun pointed at you, what would you do? Okay. You know, how many people in here open up their door at 12:30 in the morning, their front door with a gun pointed at the person who's at the door? I'll give you another example where a police officer, there's a video, and unfortunately I wanted to show this tonight, but I don't know how to, I'm not technically savvy, so I don't know how to do this. But there's a video where you see a guy, a police officer stops a car, the guy gets out of the car, and he's got a gun at his side, but you really can't see it too well. But then you hear the cop say, put it down. Drop the gun or something to that effect. I can't remember the exact words. Okay? Okay? Shot him and killed him. One shot in the head, killed the cop. Okay? Less than 2 seconds. Obviously, it's less than a second, if I recall correctly. Okay? That's how quickly this is done. So, you know, like I said, it's very nice to be in a very sanitary environment where everything works the way it should work, but that's not the way things are. That's not real life, and that's what I worry about.
Let me just say, you know, we really are like ships passing in the night. Yeah. Sure, the people who demonize police, yeah. Are there people who demonize communities, immigrants, racial minorities, gender minorities? I mean, look at the world we live in. Look at President Trump, right? Talk about demonizing people, right? You know, so it's part of our culture, right? I mean, and that's a whole problem of emotions, right?
And you got Don Lemon on CNN saying that white people are the biggest terrorists in the world.
So we'll have all those arguments. It has nothing to do with immunity, right? We're talking about when a police officer. When we're talking about a police officer does something deliberately illegal, that's the only time a constitutional right is violated. Negligence isn't enough to do it. You've got to show intentionality. You've got to show that they acted recklessly. When you prove that, right, why do they get this extra benefit? And let me just kind of crystallize it. When we talk about excessive force, you know, whether it's use of a gun or use of force, the Supreme Court has been very lenient to police officers in defining what is excessive force. No Monday morning quarterbacking. Would a reasonable officer have any reason to think that if they don't use force, they're going to get hurt, right? And so even if you think it's a glint of metal, you might be able to shoot the person even if it's not a gun. A person starts coming at you 8 feet away with a knife, you can shoot him there. You don't have to wait for him to get close. He attacks you, you can attack back. But assume, even with that very lenient standard, that a court says what you do, or a jury says, what you did was excessive, right? The guy was unarmed. Why'd you taser a 50-year-old guy who's intoxicated? There are cases out there, right? He's walking around, a little bit schizophrenic. He wouldn't respond, so you tase him. He's got serious injuries, right? And so let's just assume that in our world we would say an officer shouldn't tase somebody in that situation, right? Why in that situation should an officer be able to argue well, there was never a case like that before, right? Some officers might have tased, and therefore I shouldn't be responsible. If the force was unreasonable to begin with, how does an officer, kind of an intellectual exercise for you, qualified immunity means that you can act unreasonably in a reasonable way. I mean, that's really what the doctrine says. You acted unreasonably, but somehow we think it was reasonable for you to do it. You dilute it. And the last point is, sure, is it officers get shot? Terrible, right? Officers get injured? Awful. People are held responsible. People are serving life in prison and executed in this country for shooting officers, right? They face the criminal law. That happens all the time. Think of a world, right, in which there were no judicial remedies. Think of your Second Amendment rights, right? For those of you who are interested in that, right? Think of those who you protested abortion clinics, right? And some officer, says, you can't be here, right? And then there's an argument, well, you can't sue me because I thought it was 20 feet, not 30 feet, right? Think of a world, right, in which the rights that are most important to you, right, can be taken away by an officer, and the officer says, you can't sue me, right? I've got this immunity. It's both are stark worlds that you look at.
Let me read you this passage from an article that was written about not quite 2 years ago. It states, data collection is still inexcusably deficient in many police agencies, but the data that are available demonstrate patterns of excessive force as well as large racial disparities in the use of that force. What does that mean to you? Somebody's like, what does that mean? You want me to read it again? Okay. Data collection is still inexcusably deficient in many police agencies. You're talking about police shootings, police use of force. But the data that are available demonstrate patterns of excessive force as well as large racial disparities in the use of force. Now, does that kind of imply that there is racism in the use of force by police? Yes, would you all say so?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. All right. A, that's not true. Not all the available data doesn't say that. And that article was written by Professor Radofsky in February 2017. This is what I mean about the demonization of police. The fact is, there was a study by...
You want to give the full context. I wrote
well,
that.
I know, you're going to
No, wait.
I was not allowed to interrupt you. No, I'm not. Okay, no, and you give me all out of context routine. I hear that all the time. What he didn't say was that there are two studies, one by Professor Roland Fryer of Harvard, who just happens to be African American, and was greatly pressured to change his findings, stated that there are no differences in the use of force racially, okay? Another, led by psychologists from Michigan State, indicated that these studies revealed that under some conditions, untrained individuals shoot unarmed black men more than unarmed white men. Moreover, officers show no race bias in the observed decision to shoot. Another study by a professor here at Penn, Greg Ridgway, which won an award for the American Statistical Association, from the American, revealed that black officers are more likely to discharge their firearm than white officers in the very same settings when background features of all officers, seniority, etc., are held constant. What it shows is that white police officers are more cautious before they fire. Ben,
let me just take 30 seconds.
Take us back
The context of that article was that we've been litigating stop and frisk in Philadelphia for many years. The data is overwhelming, right? If you just look at the data on who gets stopped, so Philadelphia is 45% black, 80% of the people stopped are black, 90% of the people stopped are frisked. I make the point all the time in litigating that. I say that doesn't prove anything. People could say, well, it's racially disparate. Sure, it's racially disparate, right? But there may be non-racial reasons, right, for why more blacks are stopped. Maybe there's more crime in the black neighborhood. Maybe there are more police assigned to that neighborhood, right? And so statisticians and economists, right, you do the regression, right? And you try to test, right? You say, okay, hold everything else equal. We know there's a disparity. I gave you the marijuana numbers, right? We know there's a huge disparity. Part of the reason is some of the marijuana dealing is outdoors, right, in black neighborhoods, so easier to arrest somebody than somebody in the Penn dorms where they don't come in. I recognize all that. And I said that in the article. I said, you have numbers that may show disparity. That doesn't prove racial discrimination. I can prove racial discrimination when I can control the 100 other variables, right? When I look at economic status of the neighborhood, when I look at where police are deployed, when I look at crime rates. We've done that analysis in Philadelphia, and we've had statisticians in Philadelphia for 6 years who have said that proves this is a racially unequal operation, stop and frisk. Doesn't mean stop and frisk is a terrible thing. It just means that blacks bear the brunt of it. That's my point. It's exactly opposite of what you said. I wasn't saying just because you've got disparities, we're a racist country. Nobody says that. You look in the context.
All right, can I respond to your response? So you're rejoining that one.
He's been patiently waiting for a
Yeah.
question. So if there's no-
A couple points, I'm gonna try to be concise about this, that tends to be long-winded.
You and me both, again.
A point I was trying to make earlier, first of all, it's interesting to use the word context, because you pretended you didn't know what contextual cues meant, but
I didn't pretend, I didn't know what
the point I was trying to make earlier is that police aren't the only ones who have to make quick decisions that affect people's lives or expose them to systemic injustice. Other workers face more severe consequences for lesser wrongs than murder, or for lesser wrongs than killing a civilian, including honest mistakes. As a mandated reporter, this weighs heavily on my conscience, and I'm familiar with the statistics about race and policing as I'm familiar with the statistics about race and the child welfare system. So why are police in this special class of workers, as opposed to workers who also work in highly liable professions?
Okay, let me first say.
Are they?
Well, they're not, but this is what I'm saying, he's confused.
No,
Number one, don't accuse me of lying, okay? When I said I didn't understand what you meant, that's exactly what I meant, okay? Don't give me this crap that I'm lying, all right?
That was a joke.
Don't accuse me of lying, okay?
That's a joke.
I don't accuse you of anything, you don't accuse me, so that's number one. Number two, let me respond to Professor Radowski before I get to your issue. When he wrote this article, he also wrote that, yeah, you said that these are not dispositive, you said, okay? This issue about race. He goes, to be sure, more must be considered before these data can said to hold a causal relationship, based on race, since other factors such as crime rates or the dangers inherent in different suspects' reaction to police intervention might explain the racial disparities. That's fine, and you know, I concur with you on that one, okay? But then you said, however, in related studies involving incarceration rates and stop and frisk encounters, non-racial factors have not explained similarly large racial disparities. So now you say when it comes to stop and frisk, there's nothing available. Yet, there's a 2007 RAND study that concludes officers frisk white suspects slightly less frequently than they did similarly situated non-whites. Black suspects are more likely to have been frisked than white, stopped in circumstances similar to the black suspects, though. The rates of searches were nearly equal across racial groups. Now, this is a RAND study, and you said there's nothing there that explains that. That's not true. There is a study. Now, getting back to what you said, okay?
I apologize for my joke earlier. I wasn't
All
trying
right, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to come down on you then. I just didn't take
It was
it.
just a sense of humor.
I get sensitive. I guess I'm overly sensitive. I have to talk to my wife. She tells me that all the time. Police don't have police are given special powers, okay? You can shoot and kill somebody legally when you're a cop, okay? But you don't have absolute powers. Judges have absolute immunity. Judges can make mistakes all the time, and they get away with it. Prosecutors have absolute immunity. They get away with it, okay? What bothers me, sir, is that you have parole boards that let people out, dangerous, violent criminals, who commit crimes again. Violent crimes, murder, rape. Nothing happens to that parole board. You can't sue that parole board. Why not? I don't understand that. So they have the ability to stop crime. They have the ability to cause crime. And very often, I don't know exactly the data on this, and I've never really looked at it, but you do have problems. And I know I did a study here, I did some research when I was writing for the Daily News about 10 years ago about police officers being shot in Philadelphia. Philadelphia police were shot, and just about everybody who shot them had been convicted of a violent felony. And if you look at the Bureau of Justice statistics, I forget the exact percentage, I think it was 8 or 9% of convicted murderers have a prior murder conviction, prior homicide conviction. How could that be? You know, so they get 2 chances to kill somebody. And a lot of what David is saying, and I don't think we're quite the ships passing, we're talking past one another. I think what we're both saying is the same thing. We want to solve the problem. We just look at it in a different way. And he's a lawyer, he looks at it legally. I'm not a lawyer. I primarily was a journalist, so I look at it in terms of public relations and what's being done in journalism, the reportage that you get. And that bothers me to see that this kind of vilification goes on. And I would hope that people would look at these issues dispassionately. And yeah, you said you're familiar with police shootings. Were you familiar with the fact that from 1976 to 2016, according to government reports, young black males were 4 to 6 times more likely to kill police officers than whites?
I am actually familiar.
Oh, okay, well, good. Well, you may be the only one in this university that knows it. Well,
I went to Temple.
Oh, okay. And
MSW, College of Public Health.
Oh, okay. But so that's why, you know, but not many people know that. And you certainly don't get that in the newspapers. Right? That's why.
Mr. Dowsey, you said you had to take off, so did you want to comment?
No, I've got to leave in a couple minutes, but maybe one more question.
So one question, and sort of bring it back to the topic, and one observation first, and that is the topic doesn't exactly fit some of the discussion, in that the discussion has to do with the role of the cops in society and the degree of freedom they should have and protection they should have. And this is a very narrow topic, this extent of the qualified immunity. It's a pretty esoteric kind of narrow thing, and like the exact standard that you have to prove. And I think it kind of boils down to, you know, how flagrant does the alleged conduct. One of the things, Professor, I think you did a lot is conflating a little bit being liable and being accused of being liable. Because immunity kicks in before, I mean, that's a threshold determination, immunity. I think, you know, the degree of misconduct by the cop comes at the end of the trial, not at the beginning. And the immunity kind of knocks it out, nips it in the bud before you even get to the point of the decision. But in any event, it's a narrow kind of thing. And I guess, you know, Michael's position on it basically is cops, given all of the considerations, it should be really, really flagrant. And your kind of view is, you know, it shouldn't be all that flagrant, and it's been growing more flagrant with time. But one of the things you said is, but to bring it back to this point, and you made a point that, well, cops really don't have to pay. So this doesn't have to do with criminalizing police behavior, which everything Michael has been talking about in terms of the atmospherics really is relevant to that. This has to do with civil money judgment, and the cops, you say, virtually never have to pay that. So my question is, what is the impact on a cop of being sued? And if the impact is not, you're not going to lose your livelihood, you're not going to go broke because you're indemnified or because you have insurance. As a cop, what's the, you know, is it a big deal? Or is it a little bit of an annoyance that you have to go to depositions and maybe show up in court? Or is there more to it?
So,
and it's really a question for the ex-cop.
yeah.
For both of you.
Okay. So just very quickly, nobody likes to be sued, right? You still have to, you're being obliged to do something, that was unconstitutional. Nobody likes that, obviously. You don't pay for the lawyer, you don't pay the judgment. There is no internal, I'll talk about Philadelphia. The fact that the city settles or there's a judgment against you in the civil suit has nothing to do with internal discipline. The only way you get disciplined in the police department is through internal affairs, which is completely separate from any civil lawsuit, right? So that, it could be that if the allegation is the officer used excessive force, there could be a civil suit. There could be an internal affairs investigation. That can lead to internal discipline. But internal affairs in the police department does not look to the result of the civil suit, one way or the other, successful or not. So it has no impact on your career. There are officers out there who've been found who the city has paid millions for, right? Still in the force, and none of that counts against them in terms of promotions or anything else. It's all the internal affairs. Not to say nobody likes to be sued, right? It's not a nice process, and I understand that part of it, the emotional part of it. But to say that officers in Philadelphia are less likely to carry out their duties because they think at the end of the day I could be sued if I make some mistake. I just don't think that jives with reality.
First of all, let me preface my remarks by saying I talked to Professor Radowski before this began, about 15, 20 minutes. I have the utmost respect for him. He believes differently than I do. He approaches it differently than I do. I'm more emotional, but then, as I said, I come from a large Sicilian family, and yelling and screaming is what we did between the antipasto and the ravioli. So that's what we do. We yell. And I don't mean anything by it. So I apologize if I did that.
The debate.
But as I said, and he's light years ahead of me with the legal aspects, and you could speak to him more about that than I can. I'm more looking at it from a public relations aspect, and these attempts, and these are not by liberals, by the way. These are by purportedly conservatives, primarily libertarians, who have this a campaign, as I said, to vilify police, and it's a vicious one. It's incredible sometimes what they say and what they do, and a lot of times they're just wrong, or they're distorting the truth, etc. The attitude, you're already risking your life when you go out there on a call. Okay, you're going to go out there and. You may get shot. I mean, stopping a car at 3 o'clock in the morning is not a lot of fun. Okay, you catch a guy going through a red light at 58th and Lindbergh, and it's 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you don't know if he's coming from shooting somebody, he's coming from a bar. All you know is, boom, he just blew that light at 58th Street, and now you really do have to stop him. Could you let him go? Would anybody know about it? Sure, you could let him go. But and going back to what you're saying, police officers are bound, they have to take an action. There used to be a charge with the Philadelphia police, and I don't know if it's still valid or not, maybe David knows. It was called failure to take a police action. And there was one cop recently in Newark, New Jersey, I wish I could put it on the board here. This guy got disciplined because he didn't hit the suspect. He let the suspect hit him. Discipline for it. They called it failure to take a police action. If you want, give me your email. I'll send you the piece. The article is, But again, it's the type of thing, the exact opposite of what you think actually happens. So yeah, you've got that in the back of your mind. But then when you also think that, well, geez, they're dangerous situations, they're critical situations. But what about the one that I described? Should I ask for ID or shouldn't I? If I do, I ask for ID, and the person becomes indignant and becomes angry. What's the next progression? What do you do in the continuum here? Do you start getting angry back? As you see, I can probably sometimes, lose my temper very easily. But do you do that? Do you start, yelling and screaming back? And then, when does it become physical at that point? And if indeed it was the person's house, and that's why I kept on impressing you. I said, you would really do that? You would go back and get the ID? You would get a utility bill for copy?
Your identity first, yes.
That's unusual. I mean, please, I wish I would have got a call to your house, because trust me, nobody did that. It's the first time. I've had drivers resist showing me their driver's license, okay? Because they didn't feel that they needed to show their driver's license, because they didn't do anything wrong. Never mind that they were about 3 seconds after the light turned red, they went ahead, that they didn't want. I've had people become indignant about that. So yeah, that's the type of thing. That's more of a worry in many ways, because there, the gray area is much larger, and you're going to shoot, no shoot, okay. But when you get into these types of things, and it could be twisted around what you did, okay, because I'm sure the person's not going to say, oh yeah, no, the police officer did nothing wrong. The person making the complainant, or the plaintiff rather, has a chance to make lots of money. We used to have cases in Southwest Philly, in South Philly around Grace Ferry area, where they had somebody that was assaulted by the police. They had about 6 witnesses testify, and this was my brother's district, he was a sergeant in the 17th at the time. Yes, about half a dozen witnesses testified that this guy was handcuffed and beaten when he was down on the ground, okay? 3 of those witnesses were later found to be in Atlantic City at the time this happened. It's like what you get with these buses that they have accidents. Everybody was on that bus. But go ask something, they'll tell you, Not everybody was on that bus. They want to cash in. So this is the type of thing that happened. And that's why that may be even a greater concern than being shot. Having that prospect of being sued and then being sued for what you're worth.
I really gotta go. Unfortunately, I've got something else I've got to do, but why don't you continue the
Well, no, I
conversation?
mean,
Actually, it was for you.
Go ahead.
You had mentioned earlier that if an incident never happened before, someone could get qualified immunity if no reasonable officer could have thought it was illegal. Who are these people that are going to make that decision?
So what the court has said is, so the officer, I gave the example of, they tase this 50-year-old guy, they got a call, guy's intoxicated, they go to the neighborhood, he's wandering around, he's 135 pounds, clearly intoxicated, no weapons, no nothing. Officer says stop, he won't stop, he starts walking around, probably some mental health problems as well. And the officer decides, because he won't stop, I'm gonna tase him. So he tases him, right? Guy falls, breaks an arm as a result of the taser. And eventually gets completely nonviolent, has no criminal activity going on other than kind of walking around crazy at night, and the officer should kind of deal with that, right? But probably don't jump to a taser, right, as the first means. And the court ruled that was excessive force, or a jury could find that's excessive force. Those allegations are sufficient. You're right, it's allegations, right? You get credibility issues all the time, both sides, right? But even if you could prove that, we're not going to let this case go to trial because no court had ever said in some written opinion, right, that an officer in this situation, and every situation is different, can't use a taser when somebody's non-cooperative. So you get a free bite. And even worse, let me just end with this. Sometimes a court will say, we're not even going to say that this is a Fourth Amendment violation. We don't have to decide that, right? All we're going to say is, even if it was, since no court had said it was illegal before, you're off the hook. What's the message to the next cop, the next time around, right? The law's not settled. So the next officer does the same thing. I mean, there's all kinds of repercussions both ways on this. And you're right, you summarize it, right? How flagrant does it have to be, right? I mean, that's what it would come down to. It's a pretty narrow doctrine. I'm not saying it prevents us from going to court in very serious cases. A lot of cases, there's no qualified immunity defense. Police officer falsifies a confession. It's pretty hard to say, right? That's a valid thing that you can do, but it makes a difference. And so there are some narrow grounds there. I'm sorry, but I've got to go.
Thank you.
Yes.
We've got the room for about another 15 minutes. If anybody else has a question, I'll
Please continue the conversation.
I just wanted to, you got me thinking when you talked about the parole board having immunity.
Right.
But,
Well, no, wait a minute. Excuse me, do parole boards have immunity?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated. The parole board does. Parole officials have kind of a qualified immunity, kind of like officers. Prosecutors have complete immunity. Even if they do something, they charge you, they know you're innocent, and they prosecute you, can't sue them.
parole boards have a binary decision. You parole them, you don't parole them.
That's right.
If you didn't have immunity, the safest thing would be to never parole anybody, because you know there could be a certain amount of recidivism.
Yeah, but it's very,
Couldn't function.
it gets complicated at every level, right? This presidential immunity. President cannot be sued, right? President decides to do something completely illegal, absolute immunity. So it's at different levels, and it's not just police. Police just have the qualified. Some have this absolute immunity, and you've got to think in our system, right? How does that work?
Okay.
All right.
Like I said, we have 15. Anybody else have
Yeah.
any questions? Somebody said something. Yes, sir.
So you were saying earlier in this that you were having bad policemen on your force, but do you believe that this system of qualified immunity lets bad policemen stay on the force and be put in situations?
No, personally, and here's the thing that I always looked at. If you got a bad cop, my feeling is put him in jail. Okay. To me, the thing about lawsuits that I find rather counterintuitive is that it's like with corporations. You sue the corporate executives, okay, and the corporation winds up paying the damages. And who really gets hurt there is the stockholder. And they'll go about and do it again. To me, if a corporate executive did something wrong, Do what you did with, I forget what that was, the Enron case. You put them in jail. I guarantee you that wouldn't happen again. Okay? Because they're not going to don't put them in, a country home. Put them in a real prison. Okay? And it's the same thing with police officers. You get a bad cop, you put them in jail. Nobody likes a bad cop. They're no good. They're lazy. They're corrupt. They're stupid. They're brutal. I mean, who wants that? Who wants to work with somebody like that? I sure as hell did. And I had a couple of guys on the force, my squad that were like that. And two of them got caught. They actually were convicted of crimes, and they went to jail for them. Okay. One guy resigned, and he never was caught, but then he wound up getting murdered in a gang hit some years later. So I guess the gang around to it. What goes around comes around type of thing. But that's how bad this guy was. So anybody else here? Yes, sir.
Mike, I want to try to follow up on the how flagrant does it have to be point. See if I can better understand the difference between you and David. Given all of the way that police activities are covered by the media, by the way, in fiction, is your concern that activities that are less and less flagrant are going to be lead to litigation?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So you're worried that the line is being moved farther and farther away from really flagrant stuff?
Well, yes and no. What I'm really starting to see is that they're creating an environment where you're getting, it's like with doctors, okay? For the longest time, doctors were, they were thieves and they were making tons of money and, and they were, and insurance companies were the biggest thieves in the world and they were being demonized. So when you come to court, you already have 5 people in a jury pool that's predisposed to look at them as bad guys. And that's what I'm seeing. There was a study by Gallup last year, and Gallup determined that the most trusted people in the United States by the American public are military, nurses, doctors, firemen, and police officers. Okay, they have the highest trust for people in the United States.
It's a pretty low bar.
Yeah. The lowest bar, though, well, they're like 50% and above. Yeah. Okay.
Wait,
the low ones. Pardon?
Clergy?
No. All these scandals going around now. No, absolutely not. They're down below 50% now. The least trusted were car salesmen, politicians, lawyers, and somebody else I can't think of right now. But the point is, I'm concerned that now that's rank for police officers hasn't changed in about almost 40 years. You know when it was the lowest? It was in 1977. And when the 1977 is after the 60s and 70s, all the problems where they all got bad raps. And that's what I'm trying to see, that they're trying to take this back to that, where you've got their unpopular police officers are unpopular. Now I don't think once I wrote this on my novel, a cop is either a hero or a bum to most people. Either they think he's, cop's the greatest person in the world, he or she's great, or they think he or she's the worst person in the world. But one thing you have to understand about police officers, ladies and gentlemen, is that they're never called when things are going well. They're only called when there's a problem. Think about that. Nobody calls the police officer and says, hey, everything's doing fine. No, there's something going wrong. Usually critically wrong. I had calls where, I remember one time somebody found a raccoon in their trash can, and they called the police. And he said, get that raccoon out of the trash can, and I said, no.
It's too dangerous.
I said, you call animal control for this one, you're not getting me. But, and some people, elderly people, would be, they want to talk to somebody sometimes, and they'll make up something to have the police come. Have a reason the police come. What I was telling David, and I don't think I mentioned this before we started, was that in my district, in the 12th district, it was pretty much, there was 55th Street was a dividing line. The lower end was black between 49th and 55th. The upper end between 55th all the way out to the airport was white. Okay, except for an area around west of Island Avenue. The people in the white neighborhoods, we called them cop fighters because they weren't. They were Irish and Italian and German and English, and boy, that's all they wanted to do was fight cops. They were drinking 7:30 in the morning. They didn't stop. till, 5 o'clock in the morning, and they had 2 hours sleep, and they were out drinking again, and they were causing problems, and it was basically just hooliganism, is what we used to call it. And the African-American neighborhoods, the residents in those neighborhoods actually liked seeing a police officer. Didn't matter what color that person was, because they, as I gave you that quote from Walter Williams, they were terrified to let their kids go out and play, get hit by stray bullets, get mugged going to the store. They were victims of real crime. Now, in the white neighborhoods, they didn't really like cops there. Even though some of those people were sons and daughters or parents or even cops themselves, but these, and that was something that you never hear about. That, guess what? These people actually like prisons. It was safety for them. And when they saw a police officer, and I can't tell you how many people, when you're doing crossing guard duty or when you're walking a beat, and these are in the black neighborhoods. Hey, officer, how you doing? Blah, 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 blah. You go on the other end, they didn't want you. They didn't want you at all. So that's why I'm saying that this is why, a lot of these things aren't known very well by people, by the community at large, simply because of the way they're portrayed in the media. So, I don't know if that makes any sense to you or not, but,
Anybody else question?
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
What about the blue pledge of police officers protecting?
You mean the blue wall of silence?
Blue wall, yeah.
It exists, yeah. Yeah, you get pressure not to say anything. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a bad thing. And that's a very bad thing. It's like the mafia code of omerta. But as you see with the mafia, where everybody's squealing on everybody else nowadays, it's happening in the police departments now. Now, it shouldn't happen. I can't say that it doesn't. It does. But you got to look at yourself. I mean, I know myself I remember a guy said, well, you hang around this carnival and that's, the guy pays you an extra $10 and that's a clean note. I said, there's no such thing as a clean note. Okay, it's dirt. I said, I don't want anything to do with it. Now, did I go back and run to the sergeant and tell him? No, because I probably would have wound up like Serpico. But, I just didn't bother with him. I never wanted to deal with him after that. And I know even after I came out of the academy, too, I know they always there's always a myth about there's one rat coming out of the academy and he's planted there by the academy to inform on everybody else, and I was that guy, so they didn't bother with me for a long time either. So, that's that.
Anybody else with questions?
Okay. Oh, yes, sir.
So what can police do now, since the media portrays them usually in a negative light, to impact younger generations? For example, when I was growing up, I remember there was a police officer who did like karate. Like he taught karate, what time was that? Usually, I feel old now. It was usually after 6 o'clock on Wednesdays and Mondays. But I don't see that now in urban neighborhoods. I live in a mixed urban neighborhood in Nashville, and like we had a police officer, and like you said, like he was very respected. Like everybody loved him. Even in like suburbs or areas like that where I grew up, police officers were really respected. But all that's changing now. But I'm not sure how you could fix that. Would you have to start at the youngest generation to get them on board, or would you do college students? Like, what would you have to do to change this climate? Because police were never viewed negative that I know of.
One thing that I do, or is what I did tonight, is challenge somebody to a debate, somebody who's a harsh critic of police. The guy that was originally supposed to be bailed out, he was very harsh. David is more of a gentleman, and I was a little, embarrassed that I raised my voice, but he's very much a gentleman. Although he has his beliefs that are very strong. Okay, so I do what you're trying. I'm trying to do something like this, and I would like to do it more often. Police are very bad at public relations. It is a black box to them. The people that, it's just mysterious to them. They don't understand it. The people in the community relations divisions, you'll see cars, sometimes you'll see a car that says CR8 or something like that. That means community relations. They're supposed to go out in public and they make their little calls and but when it comes to daily interacting with the community and, saying nice things about people, finding out about things. I remember I had a call one time, young kid, he was arguing with his mother. The mother calls the cops. He's a high school student. He went to Bartram High. He didn't have money for tokens. And the mother was screaming at him that, she gives him money, what happened? I don't know, he was using it for, buying lunch or something. I gave the kid $10. You say, I go buy a bag of tokens or whatever it was in those days, for a bag of tokens. And I've seen other police do the same thing. And by the way, this kid was black, by the way, so, it wasn't that I just only did it in the white neighborhood, there was primarily in black neighborhoods. So, yeah, you do this, and you hope that that makes a difference. And you interact with people, and you hope that makes a difference. And the people that are brutal or racist and I'm not going to say there aren't any racists, but I guess what I've seen black cops are just as racist as white cops. Those guys you don't want on there. And they have a negative impact for everybody. I want to be friends in that community. I wanted to know the people. I was like the town sheriff. I always used to feel like I was like a town sheriff, okay? Why did I do that? Partially was because that's just my nature, and partially because I always felt that I'd get more cooperation out of people. And you did. You had the little kids come up to you and say, Officer Mike, guess what? You see so-and-so, he did blah, 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 blah. And I would know. I would know who did what. And I'd keep, have an idea what's going on in the neighborhood. And that made it safer. And that was my whole objective, is to make that community safe. And that's why I say I'm approaching it a little bit differently than David is, but my objective is I want people to feel safe, okay? I'm not saying this because I'm Mr. Altruism, I'm not, but my feeling is that's your job, you're getting paid for it, you do your job, and your job is to make the people feel safe. So.
I have a suggestion. He died 2 weeks ago. His name is Jack Levin. He's the father of Mark Levin, constitutional scholar, head of Landmark Legal Foundation, author, TV radio show host. This is his father. The book for children is called Our Police. His father was so concerned about how police are being demonized today in this society. We got to teach the children. 99.44, 100% of police are good people.
Is absolutely right.
And they never know when they leave the house in the morning if they're going to come home and see their spouse and children. I know firefighters too, but I don't know any other profession but the military and the police.
Well,
take
if
more
you look
risk.
at workplace violence
and uncertainty.
If you look at workplace violence, not accidents. Among accidents, loggers and fishermen they got the highest mortality rates. But as I once said to one of these guys from the Cato Institute, a fish isn't going to jump up in the air and shoot you, okay? And a tree limb's not going to, hit you with an axe, okay? It's the other way around. You have to look at workplace violence, okay? Among the most dangerous professions are police officers and bartenders and salespeople, and they have the highest rate of workplace violence. Well, you know what? It's because salespeople go, you get an insurance salesman, go into the wrong neighborhood. Like this gentleman here says he works in a lot of high-risk neighborhoods. Sometimes he doesn't know if he's going to come back that night. Okay,
that's true.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
I have to live with that without carrying a badge or a gun.
Right. And you did exactly.
And I have to work with that too.
Yeah. And that's also the same thing with cab drivers. They also have a high-risk job.
I also have to do with legalisms that tell me that I'm supposed to report something if I have a reasonable suspicion, but the court decision that defined what reasonable is used the term reasonable in the definition. So, that's really a question for the lawyer who just departed us, but I want to throw that fact out again and point out that cops aren't the only ones who have to deal with these ambiguities.
Yeah. Well, that's the elusive definition of what's reasonable, and that's the problem with it. That's why I say that's the problem with these qualified immunity issues. Okay, people, it's 9 o'clock. We've got the room, and we're going to get kicked.